We are born into a world that demands affirmation, a world that thrives on the yes. From the first hesitant steps of childhood, we're taught to appease, to comply, to accept. Consent becomes a currency, and the refusal, a transgression. But within this constant affirmation lies a quiet desperation, a slow erosion of self, where the needs of others devour our own. This is a story about boundaries, or rather the lack thereof. A story about the weight of yes, and the desperate, often futile, search for the courage to say no. This is the story of Elias, but it could be any of us. He was a man who lived his life in perpetual motion, always reacting, rarely acting. A victim of his own unwavering desire to please, a casualty of unexamined expectations. Elias' day began as a cascade of solicitations. A neighbor needing help with a heavy bag, a colleague requesting an urgent favor after hours, a friend asking for a loan he knew would never be repaid. Each request, small in isolation, was another brick in the wall he was building around himself. He didn't understand the nature of his affliction. He believed in his naivete that yes was synonymous with kindness, with empathy. He saw himself as a problem solver, a caregiver, a martyr even. But beneath the facade of compliance, a quiet resentment was taking root. It was a resentment not directed outwards, but inwards. He was a man who was perpetually late for his own life. Each yes was a cancellation of his own needs, his own desires, his own aspirations. He worked late, not on his own projects, but on the demands of others. He gave away his time, his energy, and ultimately, pieces of himself. His apartment, once a place of refuge, became a mausoleum of unfulfilled potential. He knew intellectually that something was wrong. The continuous drain was becoming palpable. There were days he woke up with a knot in his stomach, a feeling of impending doom, a silent scream that no one could hear. But he lacked the language, the understanding, and most importantly, the courage to change it. He was trapped in a cycle of accommodating others, a silent prisoner of his own making. The art of saying no for him was not an art at all, but a forbidden language. He began tentatively at first to explore the reasons behind his affliction. He sought refuge in the words of others, in the cold logic of psychology, desperate to find the key to his self-imposed prison. He read about people-pleasing, about codependency, about the fear of conflict. The truth, when it finally came, was disheartening. He was not a selfless martyr, but a victim of his own insecurities. His inability to say no stemmed from a deep-seated need for validation, a fear of rejection, and a misguided belief that his worth was tied to his ability to serve others. Each yes wasn't an act of kindness. It was a subtle transaction. He was trading his own peace of mind for the fleeting approval of others. He was seeking a sense of worth in external validation, a validation that always proved to be fleeting and ultimately unsatisfying. He began to see the patterns, the subtle manipulations he had unconsciously allowed, the guilt trips, the passive-aggressive remarks, the subtle coercion disguised as requests. He realized that many of these requests were not born of genuine need, but out of pure convenience, or even worse, a desire to exploit his accommodating nature. The weight of it all began to press down on him, not with the force of anger, but with the chilling realization of how he had been complicit in his own demise. He had become so accustomed to the role of the yes man that he had forgotten what it meant to say no. He had lost the ability to even recognize his own needs. The journey towards no was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, arduous climb. It began with small, almost imperceptible shifts. He started by delaying his answers, not rushing to a quick yes. He would say, "Let me think about it," a simple phrase that felt like a revolutionary act. This brief pause was a space for him to breathe, to reflect, to consider his own needs before succumbing to the demands of others. It was a small act of self-preservation, a tiny crack in the wall of his compliance. He didn't say no immediately, but this maybe was a powerful first step. The reactions were immediate. There was confusion, annoyance, and even accusations of selfishness. But for the first time, Elias felt a strange sense of strength. The discomfort was not from within, but from the resistance he was beginning to encounter. He understood now that the discomfort was not a sign of his failing, but of his progress. He began to notice how accustomed people had become to his compliance, how they had come to expect it. It was as if he had given them a license to his own time and energy. And this realization, though painful, was liberating. It was a confirmation of the patterns he was slowly learning to dismantle. He was not yet ready to say no with conviction, but he was learning to recognize his own boundaries. He was starting to value his own time, his own energy, his own aspirations. The seed of self-respect, dormant for so long, was beginning to sprout. Saying no, even with the newfound awareness, was like walking through a minefield. The fear of conflict, the fear of rejection, and the deeply ingrained habit of pleasing others were formidable obstacles. He found himself hesitating, second-guessing, even reverting back to yes in moments of weakness. The guilt was a constant companion. He felt like he was betraying those who had come to rely on his compliance. He struggled with the false narrative that saying no made him selfish, made him unkind. These were the demons he had to confront, the echoes of his own insecurities. He realized that the people who pushed the hardest for his yes were often the ones who offered the least in return. They were the takers, the energy vampires who thrived on his willingness to accommodate. They were the ones who feared the no the most because it threatened their own fragile sense of entitlement. He learned that saying no wasn't an act of aggression, but an act of self-preservation. It wasn't about denying others, but about affirming himself. It was about creating a space for his own needs, his own growth, his own journey. He understood that the fear of conflict was often worse than the conflict itself. He began to accept that not everyone would understand his boundaries, not everyone would approve of his choices, and that was okay. He was not responsible for other people's feelings. His responsibility was to himself. The art of saying no was not about a single declaration, but about a series of small, deliberate choices. He started by being more explicit with his boundaries. He would say, "I'm not available at that time," or "I'm unable to take on that task." The language was firm but not aggressive. It was about stating his limits, not engaging in a debate. He realized that most people, when presented with a firm boundary, would respect it. They might not be happy about it, but they would accept it. The world did not collapse when he said no. The fear he had harbored for so long was largely unfounded. He learned to prioritize his own time. His evenings were no longer a wasteland of other people's demands. He started to work on his own projects, to invest in his own passions, to carve out a space for his own growth. The apartment, once a mausoleum, began to feel like a sanctuary. He began to understand that saying no was not a rejection of others, but an affirmation of himself. It was an act of self-respect, a declaration that his own needs were just as valid as anyone else's. He was no longer a constant motion reacting to external stimuli, but an individual actively shaping his own life. The journey was far from over, but he was on the path. He was still learning to navigate the complex social landscapes. He still had moments of doubt and hesitation, but he was stronger, more resilient, and more aware. The initial days of asserting himself were not without their challenges. Saying no often felt isolating. Some relationships shifted, some expectations were unmet, and it led to a kind of loneliness he hadn't experienced before. However, it was a loneliness that came with a sense of self-possession, a solitude born not of fear, but of choice. He learned that not every connection could be salvaged. Some relationships were built on his compliance and would inevitably crumble when he started saying no. He realized that he had to make space for those who valued him as an individual, not just as a source of assistance. He realized that the need for constant external validation was a trap. He had spent so much time trying to please others that he had forgotten how to please himself. He started to cultivate self-compassion, to forgive himself for his past mistakes, and to embrace the imperfect but authentic version of himself he was discovering. He learned that true connection came from genuine vulnerability and honesty, not from a need to accommodate. He sought out people who understood his boundaries, who respected his choices, and who valued his individuality. The loneliness was still there at times, but it was a loneliness that did not weigh him down. It was a loneliness that allowed him to breathe. He was no longer a puppet dancing to the whims of others. He was a man claiming his own space, even if that space was sometimes solitary. The art of saying no, he was learning, was also the art of saying yes to himself. The quest for self-respect was not a destination, but an ongoing journey. There would always be temptations to fall back into old patterns, moments of weakness where the lure of yes would be strong. But Elias was armed with the understanding, the language, and the courage to choose differently. He learned to recognize his triggers, the situations and people that pushed him towards compliance. He developed coping mechanisms, little rituals that helped him stay grounded in his own boundaries. It was a mindful and continuous effort, a daily practice of self-preservation. He also learned that saying no was not about becoming rigid or inflexible. There were times when yes was genuine and heartfelt, when he truly wanted to help others, because it aligned with his own values and his own needs. The difference was that now it was a choice, not an obligation. He was still evolving, still learning, still navigating the complex terrain of human interactions. But he was no longer the same man who had walked that bleak landscape at the beginning of his story. He had found his voice, his footing, and his own inner compass. He was not a master of no, he was simply a student, constantly learning and refining his approach, knowing that true freedom was not in pleasing everyone else, but in honoring himself. The story of Elias is not a fairy tale. There is no grand victory, no sudden transformation. His is a journey of incremental progress, of constant self-awareness, and of ongoing struggle. It is a story that reflects the reality of how difficult it is to break free from the patterns we have built for ourselves. The art of saying no is not a magic trick, but a difficult and necessary practice. It's about reclaiming your agency, honoring your needs, and building a life that reflects your own truth. It's about recognizing that your worth is not contingent on the acceptance of others. It's a lesson that we must all learn, each in our own time, in our own way. The weight of the world does not have to rest solely on your shoulders. You are not obligated to say yes. You have the right to say no. You have the right to choose. The echo of no, when spoken with conviction and self-awareness, can be the most powerful affirmation of all. It is the sound of you choosing yourself.